Welcome back, everybody. So today we're going to do part 2 about grants. I received a lot of good feedback. It seemed a lot of people were interested in this. There was a lot of questions and emails and comments, and I kind of wanted to touch on some of these questions as I think that they can apply to a lot of different people. As always, if you like this kind of content, hit the thumbs up so we can keep growing the channel. We've gotten to 800 subscribers. We're getting close to that 1,000 subscriber mile mark. I really like the community that we're building. There's a lot of good back and forth in the comments with each other. So always look to see what others are talking about in the comments. If you have any other questions, make sure to leave them down below. I tend to answer all of them and try to make videos about a lot of them. So with that, let's get into this. Other things that we didn't talk about with grants. So a couple common questions revolved around grad school, and then some bled into postdocs, but we're gonna spend some more time talking about grad school, and then at the end we'll get into some postdoc things. So the first one is, what are grant applications that are out there for graduate students? And this is a very interesting one to think about. So there are grants available for graduate students. There's things like an F31, which is similar to the F32 for a postdoc, but this is through the NIH for graduate students. This is only for green card holders or US citizens. There's also training grants. Again, it's the same thing. It's gonna be usually through the NIH, and it's gonna be for green card holders and for US citizens. There are some odd and end type grants that you could apply for through places like the American Diabetes Association, for example, but they're not quite as much for graduate students. They tend to be more for postdocs. And the biggest reason for this is that PIs have money carved out for postdocs, but the actual funding for a grad student is going to partially come from your PI, but a lot of this is going to also come from the department. So there isn't as much pressure to have yourself funded as a graduate student. Also, when a department takes you in, they're going to make sure that you stay. So you're going to be okay in terms of funding. If a PI takes you in as a postdoc, they may only have funding for you for 1 year. That doesn't really happen in a department. They don't want attrition, meaning they don't want students leaving their programs. So they're going to make sure that they could keep you funded and inside the lab that you're working in. So that's why I didn't really put a heavy emphasis on exactly what graduate level grants are out there. It's more geared towards postdocs. Now, a really good question is, well, if I'm a graduate student, what can I do to prepare myself for getting a grant as a postdoc? And this is a really good question. So especially with training grants, those can be achieved even before you start. So I got a training grant a couple months before I started even doing my postdoc. And because of that, you obviously are going to rely on what you've done in graduate school to support you being eligible or worthy of getting these grants. So when you're in graduate school, we've already talked previously in other videos about publishing. This is like the most important thing you could do. If you publish, that's going to help. And it's also going to help as you go forward in your postdoc grant. If you could help with your own PI when they write a R01, for example, learning how grant structure works, what's important, not important, how the formatting is, this is going to give you some ideas. So if you do that and you go into, your postdoc and you apply for a training grant or a fellowship and you've already written some grants with your PI, you're going to be just one step ahead because you don't need to be taught how to write a grant or what the important components of the grants are. The other thing that you can do is that you can just start thinking about who could be references. Now, this seems like a small thing, but it's actually really important. When you're going to write a grant, you're going to need references, whether they're going to be for forming a committee or whether it's a letter of support, from a collaborator, or whether it's just somebody giving you a recommendation like, yes, this person is, an outstanding student or postdoc. You're going to need all of these different kinds of letters of support, recommendation, etc. So start planning who some of these people could be. Now, when you do start your postdoc and you start getting into like a fellowship like an F32, it's more going to depend on the work that you've done as an early postdoc. And in this instance, the most important thing that you could do is publish. Again, same as when you're in graduate school, the most important thing is publishing. Early on, it's publishing. I had a peer of mine who who was a really intelligent guy. He had his paper, the first paper he had as a postdoc, it was published in Science Translational Medicine, which is just a top tier journal. He did everything right, but he had a lot of trouble finding a grant. And one of the reasons was they thought his productivity was low because he had been in a lab for over 3 years and hadn't published anything as a postdoc. So getting early publications, even if they're not in a top tier journal, could actually be really advantageous and sometimes could actually be harmful if you go that long without publishing a first author paper. So just keep that in mind. Other questions that I received had to do with importance. So what's the most important part of like a fellowship, for example? So for a fellowship, what I would say the most important part, well, there's two really important parts. There's the research proposal that you write, and then there's the training section where you basically lay out what your training plan is. And these are important and they need to complement each other. So I'll give one of mine as an example, and then you could think about how this could apply to something like yours. So I had a fellowship accepted that had to do with lipid signaling and how that could impact metabolism and specifically cardiometabolic metabolism. Okay, and so I wrote out this whole research proposal on that, and that's the most important part. But the next most important part is the training plan. So it was more than just, well, I'm going to attend a conference every year. It was specifically laid out, these are the conferences and the times that I'm gonna go. It's that I'm going to take an extra course on radio-labeled isotopes and how I could apply that to my own research. It's that I'm gonna take this extra course through Harvard Medical School that has to do with analyzing larger data sets because I was gonna have some lipidomic data sets. It was pulling all the extras together that basically complement the research plan that I had. And that's really important. What they wanna see is that your PI has the expertise to do this, that you have collaborators that have expertise to help if you need, that you have a strong proposal, that you've backed it up with extras like classes and coursework that, you know, really can help build the knowledge base you need to succeed in this project. And that you're at an institution that can, you know, cover all of this and help with all of this enrichment that you need. And that's exactly what I did and how I was able to get funding. Now, when you get a little bit higher and you get into, for example, you know, your KO1s, the most important thing is obviously going to be your research. That's going to be the vast majority of what you're graded on. And then the next important thing is going to be your pathway to independence. Basically, how are you going to move from one lab where you're underneath someone to your own lab and you're going to be able to take on your own people and your own group? That'll be like the next important thing. Now, the last question I got is, what happens if I can't get a grant? And, you know, there's two sides to this. So on one hand, if you're in a lab that isn't necessarily asking for a grant, it's okay. You'll be able to stay in that lab and produce papers and you'll be okay. Especially if you're someone that wants to go to industry, it's not the most important thing. If, however, you want to be able to get your own independent faculty position, you need to be able to get grants. Now, if you don't get a training grant, are you going to be okay? Sure, you could go ahead and get a fellowship and you could get, you know, your career development award later. If you don't get a fellowship, will you be okay? Yeah, I do know people that didn't have a training grant or a fellowship and they were able to get a career development award and were able to succeed. It's a little bit harder because you can't demonstrate that you've successfully landed multiple grants, but it is doable. If you can't get a career development award though, that's when you start running into really big trouble. If you're going to a teaching institution, you'll be okay because you're not really required to bring in much in the way of grant money. But if you want to go to a research institute, you have to be able to get a career development award. If you do not, you're going to have a lot of trouble to actually get a position. And it may actually nowadays be impossible to get one without it. So just keep that in mind as something, is that as you're going, you're going to need to be able to get at least that career development award. So with that, we're starting to get a little bit long. I know that we kind of talked about only a few points, but these seem to be the main things that we're coming up with grants, is how could I start preparing early? what are the most important parts of the grant and where I should focus the most effort on, and then kind of like what happens if I can't get a grant. So I hope that we were able to cover all of these today. As always, if you like this, give it a thumbs up, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.